All right. Good morning, everybody. This is working, isn't it? Sorry, I put a spanner in the works with the lapel mic. I don't have anything to clip it onto. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Justine. It's really nice to be here at QUT. I did my undergrad and my PhD here, and I was just saying to Stephen, I haven't been in this room in about 20 years, so it's really nice to be back. I've only got good memories of QUT, so it is nice to be back down the river. I'd just like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Yagara and the Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So my area of expertise is environmental law in particular, and its intersection with climate change. I actually work in the very, very niche area of legal issues associated with marine and coastal restoration, which, as I said, is incredibly niche, but an unbelievable amount of stuff happening there at the moment. But I am very interested in climate change and biodiversity law more generally. So I've been given quite a broad mandate to look at actions 9 and 10 in particular of Pact for the Future, which you probably have your little document in front of you there if you want to have a look. So 9 is broadly about climate change and 10 is about biodiversity conservation. So action 9 is that we will strengthen our actions to address climate change. And action 10 is that we will accelerate our efforts to restore, protect, conserve, and sustainably use the environment. So what I'm going to do is just briefly step you through, I guess, what's outlined in both actions 9 and 10 in the Pact. But then the really important thing is that both of these actions refer to other international instruments. So for climate change, it's the Paris Agreement, and for the biodiversity action, it's the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I thought it might actually be useful to spend most of our time looking at those other international instruments and perhaps the big problems inherent in those particular instruments that we've got at the moment, and then circle back to, whether Pact for the Future is something that can perhaps galvanise more action in those two particular arenas. All right, so looking at action 9, so this is on page 8 of your document that you hopefully have before you, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but you'll see that the very first paragraph, paragraph A, refers to reaffirming the Paris Agreement. Okay, so right at the outset, it's reaffirming something else that exists currently in international law. It recognises the need for deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which reiterates some of the content from the Paris Agreement as well. This third point is a really important one, actually, and I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at an event that was all about the intersections between climate change and biodiversity, because these are two things that have traditionally been recognised differently in international law and in domestic law as well. And I think this is a really big strength of what they've put in this pact, which is that it's drawn in the environmental and biodiversity content into the section on climate change and talks about the importance of nature and ecosystems in climate change, because the biodiversity climate nexus is just such a tricky thing to navigate at the moment, as I'm sure you are dealing with in the context of your Energy Transition Centre, because that's such a critical problem. And also reaffirms other critical international goals, including around finance. So that's action 9. If you go to action 10, so this is on page 10, it's a little bit more buried, but if you get down to paragraph E, it says implement the framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So that's referring to something called the Global Biodiversity Framework, which came into effect in 2022 and is essentially a protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It talks about achieving a world in which humanity lives in harmony with nature and also conserving and sustainably using our planet's resources, as well as taking ambitious action to improve the health, productivity, sustainable use and resilience of the ocean and its ecosystems, conserve and sustainably use and restore seas and freshwater resources, as well as other ecosystems there. And this was the other thing that jumped out to me as the really interesting thing in this pact, the fact that this provision is really front-loading oceans and coastal ecosystems. So I think I gave my game away at the beginning when I said that's where my area of interest is. It's coasts and oceans. And certainly in both the conservation and the restoration space and in environmental law generally, protection of marine environments has lagged so far behind terrestrial environments. It's always been the focus on terrestrial forests, and then oceans and coasts come afterwards. So I just really liked the way that it sort of front-loaded that emphasis on the ocean and coastal ecosystems as well as forests and mountains. I think that's actually really important in driving some of this forward. All right, so look, that's all great. I think they're really wonderful commitments that are laid out there, but they are really linked to emphasising things that have already happened in other international agreements. So if we go all the way back to Rio in 1992, that's where two really important agreements were reached at the global community. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is going back to that point I made before, which is that biodiversity and climate change have always been treated as separate concerns at international law. So how these conventions operate is very similar. So they have separate objectives. So the CBD is the conservation of biodiversity, whereas the UNFCCC is about the stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations. But they're very similar in the way that they work. So they're both what we call framework conventions. They set a really nice objective. How that objective will be reached is a little bit more opaque. And in both cases, it relies essentially on countries making pledges domestically with the hope that those pledges domestically will all add up to that objective that's agreed to internationally, which they'll mention is something that hasn't really occurred in either fora to date. So in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Article 26, states are required to report on measures which it's taken for the implementation of the provisions of this convention, and that's through documents that are called National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, or NBSAPs. And under the UNFCCC, again, it talks about state parties adopting national policies to reduce emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, essentially. So both of these were agreed to in 1992, but there's been significant evolution since then because both of them also involve the establishment of a Conference of Parties, or a COP, which is met yearly under the UNFCCC, usually bi-yearly under the CBD, and as a result, both of these conventions now have much more up-to-date words on what the international position is, which is the Paris Agreement, which established nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are similar to NBSAPs in that it's the country saying what they're going to do domestically to implement the objective of the agreement, with that hope that if you add it all up, it will magically get to the number that you hope. And then the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned before. All right, so starting with the Paris Agreement then. So the aim of the Paris Agreement you'll find in Article 2 of the agreement, and it's a really bold objective. So paragraph A deals with climate change mitigation, B is adaptation, and C is about finance. But if we just look at A, because that's really the important bit for present purposes, holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Look, we're pretty much at 1.5 now, and 2 degrees seems just increasingly unlikely on the trajectory that we're currently on. But what the Paris Agreement did back almost 10 years ago, and I was in Paris for this actually, which was really exciting, is make this goal and then ask countries to go away and write their NDCs, make pledges, make a better NDC every couple of years, and hopefully eventually ratchet up to a collective combined effort that will get to 2 degrees. So it's inherently a bit flawed, but it's also really complicated to do anything more robust than that at the international level. So how will we get to this goal? As I said, through NDCs, hopefully. The UN Environment Programme published this really great report every year called the Emissions Gap Report, and the most recent one came out fairly recently, and as usual, it's not particularly good news. So this is a pretty complicated graph, but what it shows us is this top bit really is kind of where we are now. This is where we need to get to with our emissions to stay in 2 degrees, and this is where we need to get to stay in 1.5 degrees. And these are talking about where we're at with our NDCs at the moment. So our current NDCs are right up here. Conditional ones, so conditional on action of other countries, we're still way above where we need to be. So that's the gap that we need to get to 2 degrees. That's the gap that we need to get to 1.5. And then that blows out even further when you add 5 years to the timeline. So, you know, while Paris has a really great goal, and it's fantastic that the Pact for the Future is emphasising the importance of that goal, the mechanism to get us there is inherently flawed, and at the moment it's quite far away from where we need to be. The Global Biodiversity Framework, so this was entered into at the end of 2022, as I said, and it comprises 23 targets, of which these first 3 are probably the ones that have gotten the most airtime. In fact, target 3 is probably the one that's gotten the most airtime. It's referred to generally as the 30 by 30 target, which is that by 2030, at least 30% of areas of the globe effectively will be under protection. So either in protected areas rather, or other effective area-based measures. Target 2 is my jam. I've spent a lot of time looking at target 2, so that's the restoration target. So that's by 2030, at least 20% of degraded inland water and marine and coastal ecosystems are under effective restoration to enhance biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services. And then target 1's what we call the other 70%. So if we're aiming to have 30% in protected areas, we still need to be managing that other 70% of land and water effectively to manage conflicts between various land uses. I guess the devil's in the detail with a lot of these targets, and you know, a lot of you are lawyers or law students, and you probably know that. So I've spent a lot of time looking at target 2, and what does degraded mean? What does under effective mean? What does ecosystem mean? There's a lot of wiggle room in those terms that could affect how these play out in practice. But they're very ambitious goals, wiggle room aside. But again, like the Paris Agreement framework, it's a really similar path to get there. How will we meet these ambitious goals? Hopefully through what countries pledge to do domestically. And where they do their pledges is through their NBSAPs. And ideally, what is pledged in the NBSAPs will add up to what we need under the GBF. Now, under the GBF, to submit a revised NBSAP ahead of the 16th Conference of the Parties, which was held in October. So that started on the 21st of October. So with a colleague of mine, we did a study of NBSAPs that were submitted prior to the start of COP16 this week, which was very exciting. And despite it being something that countries signed up to in 2022, only 36 of nearly 200 countries submitted an up-to-date NBSAP ahead of COP16. So these are the 36 countries here. You'll see it's a pretty broad spread. Geographically, it's not concentrated in any one part of the world, so it's kind of, you know, a little bit randomized in terms of which countries did this. But we went through and read these NBSAPs in quite a bit of detail. They were between 12 to 300 pages, depending on how countries approach them. There was no standard format. And we looked at 2 targets in particular. So target 2, the restoration target, and we broke it down into its elements. So do they define degraded? Do they make commitments across different ecosystem types? Do they define ecosystems? Do they have a metric for under effective? And do they include this qualitative element that restoration's for this purpose? We then did the same thing for target 3. We looked at the meaning of ensure and enable. We looked at commitment across ecosystem types. We looked at this qualitative element. management. We looked at effectively conserved and managed, and then on the direction of the reviewer, we looked at every single other word, which took us a really long time. So I was very glad it was accepted this week. The initial thing that we saw looking at the NBSAPs is that they fell into two categories. So some of them made really high commitments to targets. Yep, absolutely, we're going to have 30% under protection by 2030. How? No details at all provided. Or there were some that were very realistic and they really spelled out what they intended to do, but then would say this might get us to 15%. So they were either realistic or they were very ambitious. And we actually drew a lot on smart target theory and framing this, which has been used quite extensively in conservation, and said they were either A for ambitious or SMRT, like Homer Simpson, for realistic, which was, a really interesting finding. So when we dug through these NBSAPs in detail, we found that only a really small number, so only a quarter of them, made a commitment to restoration expressed as a percentage. So, you had 200 countries agree to this. Only 36 of them then went and did their NBSAP, and of that 36, only 9 of them made a commitment to restoration expressed as a percentage. And of those 9, only 6 committed to 30%, or at least 30%. So we are so far off what was agreed to in the GBF. It's not even funny. And there were other sort of more minor commitments. Australia just said, we'll restore priority degraded areas, whatever that means. It wasn't defined. There was a stronger trend of committing to protected areas expressed as a percentage, but still really far off what's needed. Again, almost 200 countries agreed to the GBF, only 36 did their NBSAP, only 22 agreed to a percentage target for protected areas, and of those, only 14 committed to the 30%, or at least 30%. So again, we're really far off the mark there. The qualitative element is really important and really critical to success, and that's 30% of what? Okay, so a country like Australia, if we just agreed to protect 30%, we could easily just lock up 30% in the middle of the country, which really wouldn't have much impact on biodiversity. But both targets 2 and 3 have really important qualitative elements which require that 30% to be directed at areas important for biodiversity. And we found really patchy qualitative restoration language in the restoration target. So some might mention biodiversity, but those that engage with the target hardly made any reference to where that would be. Looking at the protection target, we found slightly more than half of the NBSAPs we looked at included qualitative elements for the protection target, but again, really patchy and really not seeing that engagement with it. Some countries made reference to spreading their ambition around land and water, but very few explicitly made sub-commitments for different ecosystem types, which, I think is really concerning. As I said before, there is this historical bias towards land-based measures over oceans, but hopefully that commitment that we've seen in Pact for the Future might help to, move more effort towards oceans and coasts. Key definitions and baselines. Again, a lot of us are lawyers. We're very obsessed with language and terms. Very few defined degraded. There were only, I think, 2 countries that made a commitment to undertake a study of what their degraded land is as a precursor to restoration. And if you think about it this way, if you define as a country degraded really narrowly, so only the areas where absolutely all environmental values have been lost, you have a pretty small pie, and then you only need to restore 30% of that small pie. But if you interpret it really broadly, areas where there's been some degradation, suddenly your pie is a lot bigger and 30% is much bigger. So, it's really critical and something that we didn't see much engagement with. And ambition to action was really weak. So most countries just made vague references to maybe we'll develop further plans, we'll set priorities, we'll identify sites, and no country has a complete plan to operationalise their commitments. So I just wanted to go through that as a bit of a case study, and it was a bit of a lightning fast case study to show that we have this enormous gap between ambition in international instruments in both the climate and the biodiversity realms, and what is actually happening at the country level. And my colleague James and I have just gone through this with a fine-tooth comb at the biodiversity level, and it's just an absolutely enormous gap between where we are and where we need to get to operationalise these international commitments. So look, reading the Pact for the Future, I think, It's great. It's really great to see these climate and environmental commitments made in this broader document. And it's really important to see this reaffirmed commitment to important agreements like the Paris Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework. But they're inherently flawed agreements in terms of the gap between ambition and mechanism. And I think what we really need to see through any further action here is just putting the pressure on countries to accelerate their ambition, both in terms of their climate commitments under NDCs, but also their biodiversity commitments under their NBSAPs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the Pact for the Future. I'm certainly not an expert on it, so I was actually a bit worried when Matthew asked me to talk about it, but when I read it, I'm like, oh no, I know about this, but I'd certainly like to, be part of the discussion and debate today and see how this agreement can help with helping to bridge this gap between ambition and practice in these areas. So thank you very much.